Today is Mr. Jesse Crossan. We're super excited that he's starting us off. At 18, Mr. Crossan was sentenced to 32 years in prison after being convicted of robbery and unlawful wounding here in Virginia. But while in prison, Mr. Crossan became a mentor to fellow prisoners. He earned a bachelor's degree from Ohio University, and he became a published author, all while in prison. And in 2021, Mr. Crossan was granted a conditional pardon from former Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. Since his release from prison, Mr. Crossan has built a substantial online following. His videos cover his own experience in prison, including solitary confinement as punishment and lack of mental health care. He's currently engaged in criminal justice reform work across the country, and we're really excited to have him speak for us today. So please, Mr. Crossan, when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So my story is kind of like the story of the anti-hero. I was a person who was completely without compassion. I mean, I was the person who didn't have compassion, the person who was out of control. And the difference between me and so many people is that I had a lot of love and support in my life. So when I got locked up and I was like, is anybody gonna call? Is anybody gonna let me, accept my calls? Is anybody gonna write a letter? Like, are they even gonna wanna hear from me? Are they gonna wanna see me when I get out? And I was flooded with letters every night. There was a mail call in the jail and they would call out your name, and guys would get pissed off because they would keep calling my name and not call anybody else's. So there were guys, the whole year I was there and never got a single piece of mail, and I was getting 4 or 5 or 6 pieces of mail every night. And the difference in that experience for me versus them is profound. I had people who, when I didn't believe in myself or I didn't believe there was any way forward, were saying, oh, well, when you get out and when you graduate from college and when you do this and when you start your business, rather than other people who are saying, look, man, when you get out, like, we really can't help you, like, you got to figure it out. And I think this is probably most strongly illustrated. I got to Nottoway Correctional Center, it was the first major prison that I went to, about the same time as another guy who had a 30-year sentence rather than a 32-year sentence. He was 18 when he was convicted, just like I was. And the people in my life had already signed me up for college. They were paying for college out of pocket so I could go. They were encouraging me to read, they were making sure I had books, I had money in my books to eat. I had all these kind of supports. And he was around people who said, hey, you got a 30-year sentence, you need to make an example of somebody or somebody's gonna take advantage. So about a year after we got there, he stabbed somebody. And the guy didn't die, but he got an attempted murder charge in addition to his original 30-year sentence. So he's probably never going home. And that's basically directly as a result of the people that were around him, encouraging him to make an example of somebody rather than saying, hey, when you get out, these are the things you can do. This is the education you can focus on while you're in. When I think about that different experience, the fact that I came from a privileged background shouldn't be the defining factor in the path that I take in prison. It shouldn't be the defining factor in the experience I have. But unfortunately, it really is. So that experience moving forward really informed my perspective and made me recognize getting out that something needs to be done. Like, we can't necessarily give everyone a family, but we can provide support and services. We can make prison a safer place. We can, for example, not have more overdoses during the pandemic than before. We could actually provide mental health services when we've taken everything away. And this is just, unfortunately, it's kind of this massive problem. So when I go and I advocate in front of the General Assembly for things that are really realistic, like the second look bill was saying, hey, we want to put on the ballot as a constitutional amendment whether everyone who gets out of prison should have the right to vote. Not even saying they should or shouldn't, but we want to put it on the ballot. And the response was 63%, I believe, of the public was in support, 60% of the House and 65% of the Senate. And it was killed in subcommittee by a group of activists who said, we don't want this to happen because we believe that this would negatively affect our position. So we're going to vote this down, even though there's basically statewide support and even House-wide and Senate-wide support. And that made me realize that we're playing kind of an unfair battle that really is more about politics than it is about what makes sense, what's right. And dealing with that situation made me realize it's something that I have to kind of start to at least do on my own, because getting the political faction in place is probably going to be difficult. So I founded a nonprofit to support reentry services in Charlottesville. So what we're doing right now is providing reentry services to kind of a pilot group of guys that are getting out, both from the jail and from the DOC, to see what they need most and how we can best provide that. Like, is it financial literacy? Is it how to be a better father? Is it simply how to get a job or decorum at work? I mean, a lot of guys have never had jobs and get in trouble because of the way they show up to work, or the way they act, or the way they interact, or the way they interact with people, because the only thing they've known is kind of a tough environment growing up in prison. And those mannerisms don't necessarily work that well when you're trying to ask somebody for coffee or ask for directions. And things that seem really obvious to someone like me or maybe to you are not necessarily obvious to everybody else. And at the root of this, I really think is trauma, which is kind of like, that's my mission. But what I realized is, I had this dream in my mind. I got a psychology degree while I was inside. I said, I want to get out and I want to teach trauma-informed care classes to people who are getting out of prison. And then I realized, it's kind of hard to teach trauma-informed care classes to someone who doesn't have a place to sleep, or who's going out to a halfway house for 90 days and then is going to be kicked out on the street, or who can't get a job because nobody will hire him. I went to Richmond to pick up a guy I knew in prison the other day because, it's a long story, but he just got out and he didn't have any family. He went through the foster care system. He doesn't have a mom to come home to. He doesn't have friends to come home to. And so he's in this halfway house and not a single person has checked in on him. We weren't really good friends, but we used to work out. And I said, well, look, let me take you out to dinner. He was like, no, it's, I understand. I don't want to We went out to dinner, he was worried about getting like the large Mountain Dew rather than the small one, because when he was growing up, he was never allowed to have the big drink when they went out. It was like, no, you get the small drink or you get water. Little things like he genuinely doesn't believe he deserves to get a large soda. And that was what I wanted to combat, and that was what, again, kind of my privilege allowed me to have. Because besides having a landing point when I got out, I had a friend fly in from California with her daughter and say, every day for the 4 days we're here, I want to take you out to dinner, I want to treat you good, I want to let you know that you're worth it. Because I came out with this scarcity complex. I wasn't going to buy anything or spend any money. Like, I was scared to spend any money. Like, what if I run out of money? What's like when they do lockdown and we can't go to commissary for 3 weeks and we don't have any soap or deodorant? Like, my mind was pretty much warped by the experience inside. But she and another person said, we're going to take you out and we're going to show you you deserve these things. You deserve to have a good experience. And I've kind of taken it upon myself to do that. So part of the reentry program, we're working with a local halfway house that's trying to reopen after just a whole financial and kind of personnel fiasco, to set up events to take people out to football games or take them out to, there's a local hiking area about an hour outside Charlottesville. My dad was a substance abuse counselor, and he used to work with at-risk youth, and his experience was he would take a group of 5 to 10 kids up there, and every single time at least one of them would start crying because they had never left the city their entire life. And they got up there and they realized, like, this is real, like, this is an hour for me, like, I can just hike to the top of a mountain and see something. And the fact that they've never even imagined that really kind of highlights the failure of imagination that really exists in poverty and that exists within the criminal justice system, especially the juvenile system. I've seen that the adult system is starting to kind of expand and starting to have mentors come in from the outside, but I think it's just really limiting. So one of the things, besides talking about my story, I want to talk about the idea of what is criminal justice, and like what is it that we're working towards, or what is it that you're working towards here? So is anybody in this room going to be a lobbyist? Is that your plan? Thank you for your honesty.
Quite possibly.
But if you think about it, like, that's an incredibly powerful position, right? You're putting yourself in a position to affect what is going to be law, what is going to be legal or illegal. Like, I think about this, I have a friend in California now who was arrested and spent time in Virginia prison for growing marijuana. He now has a $300 million business legally growing marijuana. They're not legally federally, obviously. So literally this stroke of a pen turns him from a criminal to a very wealthy entrepreneur. That's a powerful thing. Like, that is an influence that most people don't have. Does anybody want to be a criminal defense attorney? Wow, one person? Okay, so why do you want to be a criminal defense attorney?
I mean, a lot of reasons.
Okay.
It's like, the system's really bad, like, defending people. I think, very lopsided system with regards to, like, the resources of prosecutors. And I think that I could, like, in some way help with that.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this, because this is one of the things that I struggle with the adversarial system. If you have somebody that you absolutely know is guilty, you absolutely know they're going to reoffend, are you still going to do your best to defend them?
Yes.
Okay. But at the end of the day, is that ultimately the best outcome, right? Like, within our system, you're doing your job, you're upholding your moral duty, but is that really the most rational outcome? What if there was a way to say, hey, this person needs to take accountability? It's not about punishment, we're not trying to make things worse, we're trying to say, if we don't stop this where it is, things are going to continue, basically harm is going to continue to create.
I guess our current system is probably built for accountability.
Exactly. I mean, and that's my whole point, is we don't have a system that's about accountability. Our system is about punishing the perpetrator. So if someone hurts you, you don't get any of the resources, you don't get any of the focus. Instead, it all goes on this person over here is being punished. What if we had a system that was like, hey, let's heal the person who was harmed, but then also work for accountability with the person who caused the harm, so that they don't create future harm? Like, wouldn't that make more sense? But unfortunately, we live in this system. Has anybody been following the Onion say it being released?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a really big deal, right? So how many people think he is guilty? Wow, nobody. Okay, I was expecting at least one or two. Does everybody think he's innocent or just doesn't know? Doesn't know?
Probably innocent.
You think he's innocent?
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably is, but I don't know enough either. But the whole point is, you think about accountability. So if I were to, like, kidnap you right now and lock you in a box for 23 years, or at least not tell them where you were, like, that would be a problem, right? Like, that would be a crime. There would have to be accountability for that. But the prosecutor who failed to disclose that exculpatory evidence, are they going to face accountability? Is there going to be any consequence whatsoever for the fact that they could have brought this to light, but they didn't? And 22 and a half years later, this man had to walk out of prison after fighting an uphill battle that he wouldn't have been able to fight if it hadn't been for a podcaster who was, like, really fixated on it. I mean, that's not right, is it? That doesn't make sense. So my point is just that our criminal justice system as it exists has some really good points and some really bad points, but fundamentally, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't work to address the harm that's created. And I think that there is a possibility of doing that. For example, do you feel like you're more likely to be attacked living in a city like this by a stranger or by somebody that you know? By somebody else?
That's when you know.
By someone you know? Yeah, I mean, 75% of crimes are reported, or of reported crimes, are by someone that you know, or of violent crimes. And it's estimated that half of violent crimes aren't even reported. So would you have a harder time reporting somebody you don't know or somebody you do? Generally somebody you do. So if that's true, the estimate's even higher. So the idea of saying, well, do we want to punish those people? And unfortunately, what happens quite often is that someone in a complicated relationship, someone is abused by their parents who they also feel love for, so they don't want to report them because, you know, I love my mom, I don't want to do that to her. Or I love my dad, and I don't want to do that to him. Because we have a system that's focused on punishment, we don't actually get to the root of the problem. We don't even have, we're not even able to address half of the violent crimes that happen. Like, that fundamentally is an issue. And there, beyond that, there are issues with community policing and what goes on there. But my point is just that you're old enough that you're not naive, but you're young enough that you still believe that things are possible. And that's what I think the kind of magical age is. Because there was a point where I thought I knew everything when I was 15 or 16 and I ended up going to prison. That was an idiot. Like, it was a terrible idea. But then I began to realize that everything I knew had to be questioned and everything I knew had to be examined. And you're in a great position to do that. You're in an incredibly, you're an incredible institution, and you have the possibility of going out and writing laws. You have the possibility of defending people, of doing corporate law, of doing anything where you're going to have a major effect on society. And my hope is just to share a perspective that will hopefully cause you to either question things that you've maybe kind of taken for granted, or at least be open to some new possibility. Because as long as we kind of stay in the status quo, I think there's a problem, and I think it's not being addressed. I think this is the generation that gets the opportunity to address it. You had some questions. I have a couple other things, but I figured we could start with that.
Yeah, we have questions, and if everyone has a question, please feel free to jump in. We do have some prepared ones. So, for example, one is, there are many proposed criminal justice reform options that are being tossed around right now. Could you talk about maybe one that you see as being successful and one that you think would be unsuccessful or will be unsuccessful?
Sure. So in the District of Columbia, within 3 years, they plan to have more restorative justice facilitators than they do prosecutors. Because what they found is a greater satisfaction rate from the victims of crime from the restorative justice process than from the punitive process. I think that's amazing. We're going to talk about violence intervention. There's a group in Charlottesville, I just hired one of their guys to start doing our reentry classes, who highlight the fact that people have a different experience with police depending on where they're from or what their kind of like station in life is. In other words, people on kind of the north side of Charlottesville will immediately call the police because they feel safe and they feel like you're going to protect my life and my property and this is going to be okay. People on the other side of the road will never do that. They literally, I don't know that the police have ever been called except for a shooting in that area. And that was a problem because we continue to have shooting after shooting. We had far more murders than a small city should have had. So the Buck Squad, which is a violence intervention unit, stepped in and said, hey, we need to do something different. We need to stop this. This isn't working. And these are retired gangbangers, these are retired criminals, these are retired people who, like, basically the police didn't want anything to do with, and they've come into these communities, and until last week, there had not been a single murder in Charlottesville since 2020. And it was a direct result of the kind of community interactions. And one of the things the Buck Squad said is, we need to get into these schools, because right now the people that are running around acting crazy, shooting and robbing are between 10 and 15 years old. There are people at the middle school and there are people at the high school. And the middle school and the high school don't want the Buck Squad to come in. Instead, they brought back officers to the schools. Well, the officer doesn't know what's going on. Nobody's going to the officer saying, hey, these two guys have a beef, you guys need to intervene. But what happens on the street is somebody calls the Buck Squad and say, hey, these two guys have beef, you need to intervene. And they do, they show up and they talk about it, they hold them apart, they do whatever they have to do to make sure it doesn't happen. And kind of the proof is in the pudding. It's been really effective. So the idea of policing and intervention in the community and how we're going to do that, I think is important. So the idea of restorative justice, which is essentially what the Buck Squad does, is an alternative to the current system, which doesn't seem to be well received. As far as one that will not work, that's a really good question, because I think cash bail is such a fundamental question, right? It's like the idea of fines. It blows my mind that you can have anything be a fine. So if I'm wealthy, that's not a punishment. It doesn't mean anything to have to pay $100 or $5,000 or $10,000. But someone who's impoverished is literally going to possibly lose their home or their car, have to go on a payment plan and be subjected to kind of like indentured servitude for the rest of their life for the same act. That's not an equal response in any way. But at the same time, I think cash bail can be a problem because I do think the only consideration for bail should be whether someone is dangerous or not. I don't think it should ever be about money. But in those situations, I think it doesn't make sense cash money wise to say, hey, you're really dangerous, but you've got $1 million, so we're gonna let you back out. Because that doesn't make sense either. But I think that there's just gonna be such a negative public response to this. I think it's gonna, even though I think ultimately it's gonna be kind of a just practice, I think it's gonna have such backlash that it's probably gonna be withdrawn in Michigan or in other areas where it's put into place. That would be my guess.
So this kind of leads us to another question, and I'm going to let Cortland go first, and we'll cycle back. Cortland, go ahead.
So it actually kind of comes to what you were saying about public perception. How do you see like selling criminal justice reform as a concept moving forward? Because it's kind of taken a little bit of a hit with people like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco being recalled. People seem to think that criminal justice reform mostly refers to prosecutors say we're not going to prosecute some lower level crimes that may be lower level and non-violent but still hurt people. Whereas, like, for the most part, when you come to the basics, it seems that everybody wants this, including conservatives who are polled say they want to reform the criminal justice system. But I think sometimes when you use the term criminal justice reform, people think it's making communities less safe. So I guess my question is, how do you address that, and how do you sell it moving forward?
That's a really good question. So there's a representative out of either Chesterfield in Oregon, I can't remember her name, Mike Cherry here in Virginia, who I really like. He is a very conservative evangelical pastor, and he says that criminal justice reform is his work, or basically God's work through him. And I think that he reaches an audience that would never be reached by someone with a more liberal or progressive perspective who doesn't have a Christian background. And he couches everything he does in his kind of Christian philosophy and his history. He says this is all about basically protecting the tribe, and yes, sometimes we need to take action, but action should always be toward reunification and helping people be accountable, and therefore being accountable to God. I think he, and there's another guy, what's his name? Sam Heath. He works for Equal Justice USA, and he's part of their Evangelical Justice Outreach Network, and it's amazing. Like, what they do is absolutely amazing. He goes into places where people are basically saying, look, lock them up and throw away the key, and then says, well, this is my experience of Christianity, this is my experience of the Bible, and this is what I think makes more sense. Now, on the conservative political side, I think that's actually a really easy argument. Well, I mean, what are the conservative values? We want like less government intervention, we want fiscal responsibility, we want a lot of things. The Virginia DOC budget is $1.3 billion this year. That doesn't sound like fiscally responsible management. It's definitely not a lack of government intervention when every element of a person's life is kind of intervened upon. I think ultimately, if we look at this as kind of I hate to say a financial transaction, because I think that's not necessarily the right idea, but I think that kind of sells it the right way. Okay, if there's harm that's been done, well, that harm needs to be repaired. That's a financial transaction. It's give and take. So rather than focusing only on punishing the other person, can we focus on kind of righting the wrong? Can we focus on doing something differently? And the key to that for me is accountability. And as you said before, there's no accountability in our system. I was in prison for 19 years, and only one time was I ever asked to take responsibility for what I'd done. Not in court, not anywhere, never once was I asked. And this was part of a pilot victim impact program, which brought a group of people together and brought us face to face with either written or video, basically accounts of people who had experienced various crimes. And then eventually the last class was a woman who came in who'd been hit by a drunk driver and would never walk again. And it's really hard to deny or dismiss or rationalize when you're in the face of a woman who's never going to walk again. And you have her mother there talking about getting that phone call and driving out there and her being trapped in the car and not knowing if she was going to live. Like, that experience will change someone. And maybe there are a very small few people who just have no empathy or are sociopaths and won't be reached. But in my mind, if we can focus on accountability, I believe that that is a conservative value, and I believe that that allows us to move forward with kind of a non-political and really a unilateral stance. And that would be my hope, at least.
Cortland beat me to the question I planned on asking, so well done, Cortland. And you kind of mentioned it as well. I mean, you mentioned the psychopath question, and it's kind of one of the things that gets held out. So do you concede that some incapacitation will always be necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that anybody who says, even like, I don't get into the abolish prison thing. I think that's a terrible selling point. I don't think it's ever going to work. But even if I believe that most people should not be incarcerated for long periods of time, I think that anybody that presents a danger should absolutely be incapacitated. I think that's incredibly important because the safety of the community should come first. But the question is, what is the form of that incapacitation and what is the goal? Because right now what we have is essentially an expulsion policy. So if a kid acts up in school, we say, you have to go home, you've been bad. Well, the kid is acting up in school probably because they're not getting modeled good behavior at home, they may be being abused, they might not have access to resources. So we're sending them back to the dangerous place in their life and saying, we just don't want to deal with you. And that's what we're doing with prisoners. We're saying, you've done something wrong, we're not going to help you, we're just going to put you over here and then basically play nice when you come back. And if with any basic understanding of human psychology, we know that doesn't work. And it's really easy to say, oh, well, you know, that's the job of the family. And I get that so often in social media, and it drives me so crazy because if you've listened to half of the stories of abuses in foster care or just being raised by abusive parents that I listen to in prison that will just leave you in tears in a puddle on the floor, the idea of having the audacity to say, well, that's the family's job, is just so out of contact with reality. And I think that that's what we have, is we have a divide of perspective. It's not even like a moral thing. I don't think people are right or wrong or morally good or bad in that sense. I think it's just a lack of imagination of another person's experience and an inability to step out of their own experience. But again, yeah, I think anybody who's a danger to society, like I absolutely was. I was strung out, I was running, I was out of my mind. I needed to be taken from the streets because I would have hurt somebody else or I would have hurt myself. And what I needed was essentially a healing environment. And while the environment around me was definitely not healing, it was probably more traumatizing, the kind of small circle environment I had of friends and family and a few close people that I found allowed me to have that bubble healing environment, allowed me to actually get better and better myself as a person. And if we created that, if that was the goal rather than the punishment and the expulsion, I think a lot more people would come out with success stories.
Sarah?
So kind of to that, are there any like international models or things like that that you think the U.S. could aspire to getting closer to? Or
Sure. I mean, everybody always gets mad when they look at the Norwegian prison system because their cells are really cushy, or they get to play rock music, or they do something else. And I don't even think it necessarily has to look like that, but I think the principle, which is we're going to basically focus on accountability, and we're going to focus on treating people like people and teaching them to act in a situation that simulates society. Because you think about it, like, I got to be a really good prisoner, and that did not serve me well in the world. Like, I had to focus on not becoming that person. And if my goal is to say we want these people to become good citizens, well, we need to create kind of a small society. We need to create a small world in which they can learn to operate and get along well. And, excuse me, I think that focusing on that, one of the biggest things that I do, because I don't know if you know this, but prison guards have, I think it's a life expectancy of 56. They have one of the highest rates of suicide, alcoholism, and spousal abuse in the country. So the role that we put them in is not only abusive to prisoners, it's also abusive to them. It is profoundly unhealthy. And it's because it's one of two things. Either they're in a position of power where there's this horrible power dynamic and they essentially abuse that power because they have no choice, because that's the way they maintain control, because they're vastly outnumbered, or they're glorified babysitters. And this isn't a knock on them, this is a knock on the role that they're put in. And if you had to get up every day and go to a job where you didn't get paid very well and you weren't appreciated and nobody liked you, and your job was to be a babysitter, you probably wouldn't feel a great sense of satisfaction or meaning, and it may be a lot more appealing to go home and have a couple drinks, or go home and kind of take it out on your spouse, or go home and do whatever it is that people do. So I think that having one where we have more prison guards, or officers, or however you want to call them, and that they are in the role of counselor more than the role of a babysitter or guard, I think that that changes the dynamic, because it's no longer about power and control, or it's no longer about passively watching things happen, but it's about actively engaging with people. And that not only gives value to the officers and the guards, but it also gives value to the people who often have never had anybody kind of care or engage with them. It's in this kind of passive transactional relationship where it's like, okay, you do this and I'll do this, or hey, boy, go to your room, or whatever kind of abuse has happened. Having someone just genuinely have an interest in you is a really profound thing. And the closest that I found is we started a mental health program when I was at Buckingham Correctional Center. And it was a peer support program because basically the mental health department didn't have the resources to provide. We've got about 5% of the population that's classified seriously mentally ill of different classifications. And they take up probably 95% of the resources of the mental health staff, if they can even, you're supposed to have 3 people on staff at all times. I've never seen 3 people on staff for more than 3 months at a time. So you're already understaffed, you're already underfunded, you already don't have enough time, and all of your energy is going to this 5% of people who are committing acts of self-harm, threatening suicide, hurting other people, like sexual violence, all kinds of crazy stuff, to the point that the average person who's coming from a traumatized background most of the time, dealing with a traumatizing environment, is not getting any attention or care. So if we then say at least peer support people who've kind of managed to find a way or establish themselves could be of that support. Now, if that wasn't just the prisoner, but that was, for example, the prison guard who's trained as a counselor, or an actual employed counselor, or people who've gotten out and are then coming back to do that work, like, that makes sense to me as the most positive support we could have. And that's one of the reasons it was so nice to be 5 months out. I wasn't even supposed to be able to talk to the DOC employees, and somebody reached out to me. I was able to go into a prison and talk about my experience and share that with people. And that was incredibly meaningful for them, and all the people that reached out said it was meaningful for them. Or excuse me, that was incredibly meaningful for me, and the people who reached out said it was meaningful for them. And that kind of healing, kind of exchange, and kind of growth together is really what I think the focus is. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and back on the right.
When you talk about the goal of the future criminal justice reform that has accountability, do you believe that that must include then removing all forms of immunity that protect people, especially like police officers who hide behind, being like a government employee and like an agent of the police force, from committing like serious harm?
Ultimately, I think qualified immunity would need to be done away with to have an equitable system. The political ramifications of that would be more difficult because again, it's about a power dynamic. It's police officers, the whole thing on the side of the card that says to protect and serve, that's a really good ideal. And I've met a few police officers in Charlottesville and Albemarle that actually do that. There's one that I remember in the jail who would come in and he was doing rounds and he would always say, hey, I saw you got arrested, your car was parked, so like we went and got your brother and we got to move so it wouldn't get towed because I know you don't need that. Or hey, I talked to your mom, I made sure she got your kids, like, you need to get your life together, let me know if I can do anything. He was somebody who was engaged with his community. But the vast majority, and for example, right now in Charlottesville, the police are kind of so disliked that the state police may have to come in and take over the system because they're working like double and triple shifts because they don't have staff. So in that position, if I was a police officer and somebody said you're gonna take away my qualified immunity and I'm staying up 24 hours just trying to do a job, I'm gonna quit. Like, I'm not gonna do that. I think that it's because, again, the focus is on the power dynamic and essentially like militarizing the police and saying like, we're here to throw, tear gas through your window rather than just knock on your door, but also not to kind of engage with the community. I mean, we don't have people, Charlottesville is such an expensive community to live in that not a single police officer that I know of lives within the city limits. So they live outside, so they don't have any relationship with their community, so it's essentially this dynamic. We're coming in from the outside to impose control. Well, how would you feel like if somebody from Maryland came to your apartment and was like, all right, I'm gonna tell you what the rules are and you have to do this. They don't engage with you, they don't know about your situation, they don't care about your situation. And that's often the perception of people in communities where they are not receiving the kind of connection or the support that they need. So yeah, I think ultimately that needs to be the goal. But again, I think changing the focus of the intent of the police and changing the relationship with the police and the community, and even changing the focus of punishment. Because like if a police officer, I think Derek Chauvin is a really great example. Like he is the ultimate vilified police officer. What I see is not necessarily a bad person. I see a guy who's burned out, who has no empathy because he's been exhausted and basically berated and doesn't know what he's doing. He hasn't gotten enough time off. He probably doesn't have the mental health care that he needs. He probably drinks too much. So I see a guy who checked out. I don't see an evil person. I see a guy who checked out because he didn't have the resources to cope. So fundamentally, I'm not saying, oh, we need to give resources to these people and screw the police. I'm saying everybody needs this help and this healing and this support. And until we make this a universal kind of equation, well, we're continue to have this dynamic that's about us versus them, which shouldn't be there in the first place.
Hi, well, thank you for coming and speaking with us today. This has been so interesting. I wanted to go back to something that you had said about the mental health resources in prison. And I feel like there's just like this enormous problem of people with dissociative mental illness, like, schizophrenia or, anything kind of in that same vein, winding up in prison or, homeless kind of like in this cycle, and there's no resources for them. Have you seen any programs that are, working to combat that without any kind of like centralized, mental health resource for these people? I mean, what does the solution look like? Do you have any idea of like what a future would be for these people who are not necessarily violent, but they're unwell and don't have access to resources to get better?
I think there's an answer that nobody likes to that, which is to actually provide the kind of social services and care for people that they can't care for themselves. And that's not well received because it's perceived as costly, it's perceived as inefficient, but I think that's probably the answer. So there's a model, if you know about the Covenant House, it provides a lot of things actually, but the program that I'm most interested in is they provide transitional housing for people who age out of foster care. And if you look at the rates of people who get out of foster care, they very often end up in prison, in abusive relationships, being trafficked, like incredibly unhealthy outcomes. And so what the Covenant House does is say, hey, you can come to us and you have 6 months. As long as you get a job within that 6 months, we're gonna pay for your housing, we're gonna pay for your food, we're gonna give you vocational training, we're gonna give you access to counseling, we're gonna give you everything you need to kind of get on your feet, because we recognize that ideally the foster care system would provide that, but they don't. Then what they do is if you get that job, they'll allow you to go to kind of a more, not permanent, but a more established housing, where you can be, rather than 3 roommates, you have 1, you can be there for up to 3 years. And so what they do is essentially give a landing pad for people that didn't get those resources in the first place. And there's a group in, I think, Richmond that's trying to do that for mental health care. They're trying to say, hey, what would it take to get the funding to basically create a landing pad to help people get stabilized, get access to the services they need, and essentially have a residential facility where we provide everything that's necessary with the goal of sending people on their way with the resources and skills that they need to succeed. That's the best model that I've seen, and I think it's just so horrendous because we were trying to, as part of this reentry program, work with trauma-informed care, and so I reached out to the Community Service Board in Charlottesville. It's between 3 and 6 months to get an appointment of any nature there. If you need medication, they'll put you in the office with a psychiatrist for maybe 2 minutes, and they'll basically give you whatever you say you've been on or you say you need. So the idea of an actual established relationship, I don't think is going to be there because we don't have the resources, we don't have enough people becoming counselors, and we don't have the money to pay them. But I think at least providing those most basic needs and having a counselor on staff would allow them to become a little more established, less likely to be incarcerated, less likely to cost taxpayer dollars for that, and instead hopefully go on their way. And I don't know the statistics, so I can't say that it's like statistically successful, but that's a model that makes most sense.
Another question for you, sir. So I understand you've been asked to be an expert witness recently here in Fairfax County, actually. Could you tell us a bit more about that and what sort of work you'd be doing in that regard?
So the Public Defender's Office reached out and said they'd had an exchange with this judge in particular where he essentially said, why would we order any kind of services for this guy? He's going to get that when he goes to prison. And what they realized was that the judge was under the impression that all these services were available that aren't, and that the conditions would be far better than they actually are. And then if the judge is under that impression, this is somebody intricately involved in the criminal justice system, like what did people on the jury think? Like what does everybody else think? So he asked me to come in and be an expert witness as to what the conditions of confinement would be, what the available programming would be, and what essentially the experience of this individual would be were they to be sent to the Department of Corrections. And his goal was to essentially get a mitigation and say that this is probably not going to help this person get better. This is probably not going to help. Long-term incarceration is not going to make this person less of a threat. The judge listened to the overview of the testimony, then disqualified it. Didn't allow me to speak in front of the jury. I was supposed to speak in front of the judge, and then he changed his mind at the last minute, like while I was waiting to speak in front of the judge, and then they sent me home. But I think it's an interesting point that there's an opacity around the Department of Corrections, like the kind of the stereotypical thing saying, oh, the walls aren't to keep people in, they're to keep people out. And the reality is, has anybody in here ever been inside a prison? Okay, well, never mind, you guys have had an experience.
Yes, but not forever.
My experience is that most people haven't, and if they have, they've been in kind of a very, an environment that's been shaped to look like what it's supposed to look like. Although I've actually heard some horror stories of people who've gone inside and like seen the giant roaches and been like, oh wait, it's not what I thought it was. But I think that the idea that we don't know what's going on in the prison system is kind of a failure of the social contract, because people complain all the time about their taxpayer dollars, and their taxpayer dollars shouldn't be going to support this or shouldn't support education or support whatever, but they don't seem to care that, again, Virginia DOC has a $1.3 billion budget and doesn't seem to be doing the greatest job. Although we do have a fairly low recidivism rate, and there's some issue with assisting that. But generally, that's kind of attributed to just making people age out by giving them far longer sentences than the national standard, which is an effective tool, but it is, again, not necessarily financially viable and essentially not socially viable, because we're, in my mind, wasting people or wasting people's potential.
In the back, too.
I just have some anecdotal evidence to offer. My brother-in-law used to be a prison guard. Former Marine, 6'4", 250. First time we met him, I think he went to the gym at 5 o'clock in the morning. I was like, oh, I would never have I'm not a morning person, I never could do that. He just kind of gets serious. He said, yeah, I have to do that so I come home at night. So that was kind of his attitude as a prison guard. And now he's in special education, much happier person.
I think about that. So when I was at Nottoway, there was this weird culture of mixing the guards and the prisoners as far as working out, because they had a guards weight room over in this, I guess over in the gym area. It was like we couldn't go in there, but you had guards who were like phenomenally strong. Every now and then they would come out on the weight pile and they would lift weights and try to outlift the prisoners and vice versa. But this was part of a culture, this group actually was part of a culture where, I don't even know how to, I don't want to describe it as a good thing, because I don't want to say it was a good thing. But like their response to things was to treat people like an equal, and they would fight you. Like if you had a problem and you didn't like them, they'd be like, we can go in the cell and we can fight. And in the weirdest way, that was the most humanizing thing, because it wasn't, I mean, what you see now, unfortunately, is for that guard who decides he has a problem with somebody, is they'll wait for something to happen, call them in, they'll get the goon squad, they'll jump on them, they'll beat the crap out of them, they'll drag them to the hole. So there was a certain humanizing factor to that, even though, again, I don't necessarily agree with the methodology. But it was interesting to see that interplay, because it became really friendly, and it became almost more peer-based. It was, the power dynamic was gone, because it was like, you work out and I work out, we have this common ground. Like, you think you can fight, I think. I don't know, there was something really weirdly kind of comforting about that. And then there was this big fiasco about that happening. They moved all those guys out of the hole where it used to happen most of the time, and it ended up shipping them somewhere else. But yeah, it was a different experience.
Yep.
So I think the point that people just don't know what's happening in prisons is a pretty profound one. I worked as a prison chaplain, and I remember the first, at a boys' prison, I remember the first time I saw a boy like tackled and peed himself because he got beat up. And like I have all these stories, and whenever I tell them, people are like, wow, that's so crazy, that's so horrible. Like people are so shocked.
Yeah.
So, but I can't quite figure out how do we bridge the gap so more people know how horrible these prisons are. Even the good ones are horrible. And I heard someone joke like every prosecutor should be required to spend a night in jail. Every defense attorney should be required to work in the prosecutor's office. But I can't quite figure out how do we bridge this awareness gap, knowledge gap.
I mean, my response has just been to go to social media, to kind of share my stories and my experience, because that's the only thing I can think of. I would like to see an expansion of that, and there are some people who've done it, but the problem is that people who tend to get a lot of traction tend to kind of focus on the gory details and not the reality. They either tend to demonize the staff, or they end to focus on the violence and kind of glorify it. And I think there's a way of kind of bringing a broader focus to it, and I would love to see, a prison system that decided to highlight that. And it's interesting, you asked about another country. So Amend is an organization that's trying to bring the Norwegian model of justice to American prisons. So they're working in Oregon, they're working in California, that's a more complicated situation, and they're working in North Dakota. And what they're seeing is the staff is really the most upset by this. They're like, wait a minute, we can't beat them up anymore? Like, this isn't okay. But what they're seeing is reductions in violence, they're seeing reductions in conflict with staff, they're seeing reductions in recidivism, although that's really preliminary, so I can't say that for sure. And all it is basically treating people more humanely, treating people better, saying we're not gonna punish you, we're gonna take away this power dynamic. If something's wrong, we're gonna ask you, what you need. And I think about the experience I had with, there's a woman named Miss Carr, who was this basically little old lady who reminded everybody of their grandma. Like, regardless of who you were, something about her reminds you of your grandma. And she used to work the academic gate, and every time somebody would come in that was angry or out of control or doing something, she would say, no, come on, boy, you sit down, you can talk to me. And she would do it. And you would watch these guys who were like on their way to go to the class to get a knife, to like whatever it was, she would sit them down and she would talk to them. And they would explain what was going on, and they would be angry, and by the end of that vent session, by the end of that, they would leave and not do whatever dumb thing they were about to go do. And it was just that moment of being seen as a human being and having someone care enough to say, hey, what's going on? What happened? Like, what do we need to do from here? And unfortunately, that was very rare, because generally the response to that was they would call on the radio or they would grab their can of Ace, they would know something was gonna happen. And that's one of the reasons I've actually had that question a lot about whether I think women should be able to work in a men's prison. And aside from any like legal issue, I think it's actually an incredibly calming factor. I think it's incredibly helpful, especially women that are mother's age or kind of grandmother's age, because there tends to be a strong connection to that to a lot of people in prison who grew up without a father figure.
Ernie?
I agree that we desperately need criminal justice reform in this country. But it's like after this conversation that you've been having, I was kind of curious, what do you think about, like, why should we prioritize criminal justice reform over, like, say, foster care reform? We're trying to fix, like, those issues first, or do you think this is, like, impossible? We're never going to get to a state where we can fix those problems to even, like, the, like, help the prison system?
No, I absolutely think those things need to be a focus. I just don't believe it's an either or. I focus on criminal justice reform because that's a majority of my experience. So I speak from that experience, and I don't want to speak for the foster care system except for the stories I've heard. But I think it's equally important to have people out there sharing stories of their experience in foster care, of what works and what doesn't work. Like, for example, I heard horror stories all through my time in prison, and I thought every foster care was going to be horrible. And we moved in next door to a family that has had 17 foster kids, and is absolutely incredible. They still have, I think, 5 kids in the house or 6 kids in the house right now. One is their biological child. But every kid goes in, is loved, is cared for, is fed, is connected with resources to make sure they can either go to college, or they can go to vocational school, or they can get a good job. Like, they're an amazing family. And I didn't know that. Like, I actually had only a negative view of that. But I believe that the more we can highlight the need for that, or the need for mental health care, or the need for essential basic social services, I think they're all, they kind of work in tandem, and I don't think it's, I don't think that one thing is going to solve everything. So essentially, I think everybody needs to have a piece, and I think that anybody who has an experience with that or a passion for that should absolutely take that lead, because I believe that's going to make a difference. Like, yeah, if you fix the foster care system, you're going to cut out a lot of the need for criminal justice reform, because you're not going to have as many people in prison.
So we've got a couple more questions, and I think that's going to be about it on my end, at least, unless anyone else has questions out there. But you've mentioned solitary confinement and mental health care access a couple times, and that's something that comes up in on the legal side, particularly with the 8th Amendment and the question of whether or not solitary confinement, lack of mental health care is cruel and unusual punishment. Could you talk a bit about your experiences with either of those items, and whether or not, at least on the receiving end, if the terms cruel and unusual, not the legalese, but just the plain meaning, if it kind of seems cruel and unusual on the receiving end in prison?
Sure. I think it really depends on the person. Because I went to the hole a number of times over my time in prison, and generally the first week was almost relaxing or calming, because it was loud at night, but I would just sleep. I would manage my sleep schedule to avoid the kind of craziness. But I wasn't surrounded by people, I wasn't surrounded by chaos, I didn't have to watch my back. In a weird way, it was incredibly comforting. But after that week, it began to kind of wear on me. It began to feel empty. And I think I had a lot better coping tools than most people did, and that was what made the difference for me, for it to not kind of break me. Remember when I was at Nottoway, there was a guy, I can't remember what I was in the hole for then. I think it was, I actually got into a fight. But there was a guy who'd been back there, basically had a mental health breakdown, and rather than give him treatment, they just locked him in the hole. And so he was in the cell, he'd been back there for 6 months, and he had covered himself in feces and rubbed it on the wall. And again, rather than get him mental health or some kind of treatment, their decision was, okay, well, we gotta get him in the shower. So they went in with the shock shield, which is essentially a riot shield with a taser on it. And they shocked him with the taser. They were wearing full Tyvek suits, and then they dragged him. So we watched them drag this inert, unconscious man covered in shit out of the cell, threw him in the shower, turned the button on, and then locked the gate. And I remember thinking that if that is a response to a mental health crisis, that we have a serious issue. And unfortunately, I don't, again, think it's malice. I don't think that they were necessarily bad people. I think they were exhausted. They didn't have the support and the resources or the training. But that is generally the response to needs and trauma. Maybe we had a number of people kill themselves in the hole over the time where they would say, hey, I need help, I need help, I need help. And they say, yeah, go fuck yourself. Like, you know, you've said that before, we don't have time. So yeah, I think it depends on the individual what the response is. Like the longest I did was 3 months. We had a group of Rastafarians who spent nearly 20 years in the hole because they refused to cut their hair. And the DOC said, if you don't cut your hair, you can't come into population, but we'll let you, you know, live in the hole. When the lawsuit was finally won and they were released, they were profoundly affected by that time. They did not do very well in population. They did not do very well sharing space with other people. They weren't necessarily violent, but they were not stable, and they were not comfortable around other people, and other people were not comfortable around them. So I would say that solitary confinement essentially, especially with the lack of like training or support or resources to transition back to cohabitation, essentially broke their ability to function as a normal person in the confines of that environment.
So the last question I have for you, sir, you know, obviously in this setting you're talking to a lot of people who are going to be lawyers, hopefully, right, we all pass our classes. But at least some of us might become criminal justice defense lawyers, we might become prosecutors, we might become judges. Do you have any advice specifically to that sort of audience of what you would tell people who are going down that career path now, so that in 20, 30 years they kind of have that message with them?
Again, you know, you started with the question. I would like to see a shift in the criminal justice system to where it's about accountability and healing rather than about winning. You know, that the idea that it's about winning, again, it's like the Untitled thing. You have a prosecutor who doesn't care about necessarily even getting the right person. As long as they win, they, you know, feed the kind of public need for satisfaction. They're going to get reelected. This goes great. Like, congratulations. And on the defense side, they're going to do all these underhanded things and try to make this person, you know, look less guilty or get them off because that's their job. And while I believe that fundamentally in that role, that is essentially your job, and if you do it, you're doing your ethical job. I don't believe that's the ideal outcome. But I remember thinking about, I have a friend who was a prosecutor in Louisa County, and she ran to be prosecutor or Commonwealth's attorney only because she didn't want the other person to go, because he was, I mean, his campaign slogan was like, death for something. It was horrible. And so she ran, and she said every time something happened, my goal was to see like how we could reform this, or we could resolve this in a way that made the most sense. Like she had this multi-jurisdictional thing where this guy had stolen a bunch of credit cards on his boss, and his boss was saying, all I want is the money back. Like, can you just make him pay the money back? And so she went to the guy and gave him the option. All right, well, you can pay the money back and satisfy your boss, or we can charge you with all these things, and I have to network with all these other Commonwealth attorneys where you've done all these different, you know, crimes. Or like I said, we can just basically drop the issue. He went, he got the money from his grandma or from somebody else, paid the guy back, and that was it. There may be problems down the road, but the idea that at the end of that situation, everybody got what they wanted, that makes the most sense to me. And I think that ideally the defense would be able to do that as well, because what I found through the victim impact program and through conversations around that is generally what people want most is to be heard and seen, and that our system does not give them that opportunity and doesn't give them that validation. So people who have been victims of crime are often feel that they're not a part of the process, and there's this kind of false dichotomy that, well, do you want this person in prison or not? Well, there's no other alternative. Like, would you like, and this comes from that victim impact program where I asked a woman who's in a wheelchair, because I struggled with guilt and kind of self-blame and these things for most of the time that I was in prison. And I said, as someone who's hurt other people, as someone who's caused great harm, I need to ask you this, like, this is really important to me. I said, what do you most want? Like, what could most make you whole, or make you heal, or make like anything better? And she said, don't do it again. And do whatever you have to do to make sure you don't do it again. And this was very relevant in her case, because the person who had hit her and put her in a wheelchair had gotten out of prison, he had served his time and was now drinking and driving still, had been in an accident that he managed to get away with because of a really good defense attorney. It was kind of a horrible situation, and all she wanted was to have nobody else have to go through what she went through. And that's not everybody's response. I think that other people may want vengeance, and I think that's a really natural thing. It's a really good human impulse in kind of certain survival situations, but ultimately we need to ask ourselves what it serves in the kind of bigger picture. But I would say ultimately, if you can be in a position to give everybody what they want or what they need, if you can have a person be accountable or be willing to take accountability in a way that gives the victim what they need, like for me, it would be worth doing that, even if it meant spending some time in jail or prison, because at the end of the day, I would feel better about myself. And that was one of the reasons that I insisted on pleading guilty and not going to trial, even though we could argue this, we could fight this. It's like, no, like I did great harm. If I'm going to put people through a kind of a re-traumatization of this, if I'm going to make people suffer more by not pleading guilty in the hopes that I'll get off, like I'm not taking any accountability. And I don't know what that role looks like necessarily as a defense attorney, because again, your job is to win and not to be a good person or not to, get the person off, or I mean, not to, resolve it. But that would also be my goal. And as a judge, so I had a judge, my sentencing guidelines the day I walked into court were 8 to 13 years. And then they were modified and they became 10 to 16 years, and the judge sentenced me to 32 years. I don't hate the judge. Everybody in my family, everybody knows that he's an asshole, he's this. I, again, think he's in an impossible situation. I mean, he's had maybe 15 minutes of his life to see me. That's all he knows about me. He doesn't really know who I am as a person. He doesn't know my past. He can't possibly know my future. And yet he's being asked to be a fortune teller. They're saying, hey, we want you to know when this guy won't be a threat. Like, we want you to impose an arbitrary amount of time to decide when society will be safe from this guy. And that's an impossible task. So I don't think he necessarily did anything wrong. I don't necessarily think he did anything right. And what happened with him, I think, is really kind of reflective of what I think needs to happen in the system. So he continued to have kind of erratic and unexpected behavior, and finally was brought up on charges in front of the Judicial Review Committee by both the Commonwealth's Attorney and the Public Defender's Office on the same case, which says that he was really not even making sense. He was found guilty, or I don't remember the terminology with that, but they basically said, yes, you violated the canon of ethics, and they were going to kick him off the bench. It went in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court kind of said, well, we like you, so we're going to ignore the fact that, yes, you did violate the canon of ethics, but we can avoid this. And he then stepped down from the bench, which I think was part of the kind of agreement, but because we live in an area that doesn't have a lot of judges, he was immediately put in as a substitute judge. And everyone today, from the Commonwealth's Attorney to the Public Defender's Office, says he is by far the best judge in the area. Because essentially he was acting erratically and irrationally, and he was not making good decisions. He was called to account. He was held accountable, well, kind of. He was initially held accountable, and the Supreme Court didn't. And he changed his behavior. And I think that is the goal of criminal justice. That is the goal of not punishment, but rehabilitation. To call people to task, ask them to be accountable and change their behavior. And ideally that would be the result of any proceeding for anyone who's done something that has created harm to others.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. All right, everybody, there is fresh barbecue. I've been told the brownies are amazing. Please go get some food. We have the room until 1:30, so you have some time. Please get some food, talk to each other.